Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. This conversation was part of FODI Digital, which was inspired by the Festival of Dangerous Ideas theme for 2020 of Dangerous Realities. FODI Digital is a conversation series with leading thinkers on today's dangerous realities. The full program was live streamed and is now available on demand for free via the FODI website. Because this was taken from the live streamed conversation in digital video call format, the audio quality is of a lower fidelity than we usually present. In stripping away so much of ordinary life, the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed a lot about us, not all of it pretty. It's also confronted us with brutal ethical choices. Who deserves to be saved when you're running out of ventilators? How much are we willing to give up so others can get by? Who gets to decide, and what beliefs are shaping their decisions? These are some of the starting points philosophers Matt Beard, Eleanor Gordon-Smith and Bryan Mukandi use as they unpack the crucial lessons and hidden costs of our choices in this session, Ethics of the Pandemic.
I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where I am. I'm on Gadigal land, the Eora Nation, and acknowledge their unceded sovereignty and custodianship of this land, and also to acknowledge the traditional owners of wherever you're watching this from, because this is a thoroughly global FODI that we're experiencing at the moment through this interesting time. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about now, is the ethical implications of the current COVID-19 pandemic, which has peeled back some of the ordinary distractions that we face in society that can allow us to move through without interrogating some of the deeper ethical and philosophical implications of the way that we live our lives. It's forced us to confront some really brutal choices around who to prioritize, how to deal with limited resources, and perhaps a little bit about who we really are. And that's precisely what this session is about. We want to ask the questions that sit behind the questions, the really deep moral and philosophical issues that are at play here. And joining me to help with this conversation is Bryan Mukandi, a philosopher and health researcher from the University of Queensland, and Eleanor Gordon-Smith, philosopher, author and PhD candidate at Princeton University. Welcome. Thank you both so much for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
So, Bryan, I want to start with you. So you've got a background in practicing medicine in sub-Saharan Africa, which is a pretty intense environment, I would imagine, to think about the practice of medicine. What insights have you received from there that you think might inform the way in which you're thinking about the current pandemic? And has the response, at least in Australia, and then if you think about around the globe, has that left you feeling, optimistic or pessimistic, or has it coloured your interpretation in any way of like how we're going, morally speaking, as a society? What does it tell you about humanity?
Thanks, man. That's a great question. I mean, so I was reflecting the other day that my medical training and my medical practice was at the height of another pandemic, right? So the height of the HIV and AIDS pandemic, and I was working in the public health sector where folks don't have access to antiretroviral drugs for the most part. And I think the biggest thing for me there was the recognition at that time that the value of an African life isn't the same as the value of other lives. So when 9/11 happened, for example, I was genuinely surprised. Many of us were genuinely surprised at the concern about that level of loss of life, given the loss of life that we were experiencing on a regular basis, that wasn't eliciting the same kind of global response. And in many ways, this pandemic has reinforced that for me. I come from a philosophical tradition where humanity is a norm, it's a goal, where one's existential imperative is a lifelong quest to achieve one's humanity. And that hasn't really changed. How I feel about people, though, about the social structures we've chosen for ourselves or we've accepted, I mean, that hasn't really changed either, but in a negative rather than in a positive sense.
Eleanor, you're joining us from New York State, which is one of the hardest hit areas in the US, which is one of the hardest, if not the hardest hit nation around the world. dealing with the pandemics. What's your experience like there? And if you look back home to Australia, how do you compare? And to add something else onto that question, you actually chose not to travel back to Australia when things were heating up for kind of largely ethical reasons. So can you talk us through that as well in your decision-making process?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't want to take too much ethical credit. Part of the decision for not coming home was also purely pragmatic in that I'm on a visa here, and it was a long way from obvious for me that I would be able to get back across the border into the United States in a few months' time, given what we know about both this administration and the way that crises like this one tend to present opportunities for the hardening of borders and the exclusions of people who, are thought to not belong. But I'm not going to say that it didn't occur to me fairly early on when I started thinking about the way that this virus would work, that healthcare in the United States is not, is not as accessible and is not as reliable as the kind of healthcare that I had grown up with in Australia. And it really did occur to me that I might be in a position where if I caught this, I might go bankrupt as a result of it. It would depend on my insurance, and that wasn't obvious at the beginning of this crisis. And I thought quite seriously, if I start getting a dry cough, if I start getting symptoms, do I get on a plane? And do I go home to Australia, where at least I know how Medicare works, and I know that I'll be in contact with roughly reliable healthcare? And then I thought maybe I should just go home preemptively so that if I get sick, I'll be in contact with these kinds of institutions. And I thought about this kind of semi-seriously for about a day or two, and then I realized that there was just a kind of trump card on top of any consideration of mine, which was that if I traveled either with symptoms or preemptively, there was a very real chance that what I would be doing is transmitting that to someone else. And while it's true that there's no one person who can make it the case that this pandemic stops, I didn't feel okay about it being even possible that someone's grandparent or parent died because I had moved through an airport when I didn't have to. So I sort of felt like that was an unanswerable ethical objection to the prospect of going home, and decided that it was basically not a question of better outcomes, but a question of what was a permissible choice. And it was an impermissible choice for me to go anywhere near JFK or LAX or the Sydney International Arrivals Hall. So I'm still here. I'm still here in the land of the free, in the home of the brave. Which leads me to the second part of your question, which was what difference do I think there is between the way that the United States has reacted to this and the way that Australia has reacted. I'm always a little reticent to speculate about the nature of America, partly because it's just so diverse. But I think that is in itself an answer to your question. So one thing that's been really vivid in the way that the United States has reacted to this is the fact that the States is what it says on the tin. The States are the states. They're an array of states. And that means that you have a kind of patchwork arrangement, not only of approaches to the virus, but of approaches to governance. So you see this kind of clash between the power of the governor and the power of the president, and then you see clashes between various governors, and you see a kind of fractiousness and fracturedness that you just don't see in Australia. And that kind of division, I think, is something that we don't necessarily have that much exposure to. And it's very easy to forget in the media presentations of the United States that is true. And I think also there's a very different cultural expectation here about the way that individual freedom ought to work. And this is something that I found very kind of confusing when I first moved here, was that the lexicon of individual freedom is more than just a lexicon. It's the foundation. And something very interesting is occurring where people seem to feel like the reaction to a crisis is itself an imposition in a way that the crisis itself maybe wasn't. Attention is going on how we're reacting to the crisis rather than on the crisis itself. And that's leading people to have a kind of somewhat entitled sense, I think, to the fact that we ought to be free of this. And it's enough now. And I need to know when I can go back to work, and I need to know when I can get a manicure again. I mean, these are caricatures, of course, but they're caricatures based on reality. And there's a kind of a not wholly caricatured identity in the United States, according to which your freedom is, in this case, quite literally worth dying for.
One of the things that I keep coming back to, which speaks to this question around individual freedoms, is this quote from the feminist philosopher Carol Gilligan, who championed this approach at the ethics of care. And she talks about this idea that, we live on a trampoline, and whenever we move, it kind of affects everybody else in the same way. It makes other people wobble. Your activities cause discomfort to others. And I think one of the things that this pandemic has crystallized for me is this sense that this whole idea of this atomized individual with like rights that cluster them off and divide us from other people is kind of illusory. Like, we are radically dependent on other people. We have this interdependence and these mutual obligations that are just based on, not even on morality, but survival, but certainly that inform our kind of moral response. But that got me thinking about how difficult it can be to muster that sense of mutual obligation in a society that does just talk so heavily about ourselves as individuals. We've been conditioned to think about ourselves in almost exactly the opposite way to the way that this response requires us. I do want to hear from both of you, maybe Bryan first and then Eleanor, on just how you think about that tension between what's needed and maybe the ways in which you're conditioned. Like, have I set this up in the right way? Is it true we've been conditioned in this way? How do you think about this?
It's so it's really complex, because on the one hand, I think you're absolutely right. I love that metaphor of the trampoline, and I completely agree. There's this idea of autonomy, this idea of this autonomous, free, liberal individual. It just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. But at the same time, on the other hand, I mean, I was thinking about Eleanor talking about the fractiousness and fracturedness in the US. I think that applies here too in some really interesting ways, right? Like, so here in Australia, so yes, we're all on this trampoline, but the real estate that you occupy on that trampoline makes the world of difference. And we have a kind of social structure, a social organization where there's an investment in occupying good real estate. There's an investment in occupying this kind of position that means that when something happens, a natural disaster, a fire, floods, a pandemic, there's an investment in being in a position of being able to enact something like that illusory autonomy, right? And I mean, like, the two quotations come to mind. I think about Martin Luther King's idea of an inextricable network of mutuality. But he raises this, though. He conjures this at a moment where African Americans are in a particular kind of relationship with white America. So he acknowledges that there's this mutuality, there's this connection, but the nature of this connection is one that's really detrimental to some groups of people as opposed to others, right? And I also think about Frantz Fanon saying Hegel's dialectic of recognition, this idea that our selfhood emerges in relationship with others. He's like, it falls apart in the colony, because in the colony, the white doesn't want the colonized recognition, they want their labor. And so I think, while on the one hand, COVID has shown us that this ideal of autonomy doesn't stand up to scrutiny. It's in really interesting ways, though. I think it may, at least for some groups of people, legitimate this project of striving towards that kind of autonomy, of occupying the best possible real estate on that trampoline, as opposed to reconfiguring the trampoline itself.
Right, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we look at the responses of consumers in supermarkets and the kind of panic buying phenomenon. So we'll come to that. But first, I want to hear, Eleanor, what's your read on this?
It's a really good question. And like Bryan, I think it's a very complex one, and one that we're not going to compress either now or in a pandemic writ large. One thing I think that is kind of a shame for me, living in the States and seeing the way the States is covered internationally, is the way that the face of a lot of the pressure to reopen is construed in these kinds of individual autonomous terms. So I have a lot of family and a lot of friends who I think are really genuinely very concerned about my proximity to New York at the moment, and they feel like crisis, real proper, everyone's dead crisis, like blood in the streets type crisis, is right around the corner. And my suspicion about why they feel like that is that they've seen these videos of, women hanging out of cars at intersections, blowing the horn at medical workers, or protesters, armed protesters walking into government buildings, people with the American flag painted on their face, holding banners about the right to return to work. And these people are both, they're a very individualistic face of this movement, and the movement that they claim to be espousing is very individualistic. They're making claims about people's individual rights to get back to work, and they are doing so, claiming to speak as individuals. But one of the things that I think it's a shame that obscures is that the pressure to reopen America comes from the fact that it's a non-accidental feature of the US American system and the US like economic system, that it wants people to be back at work more than it wants them to be safe and well. And we encounter that from the mouths of individuals who present themselves as autonomous in saying things like the cure cannot be worse than the disease. But the pressure isn't just from rhetoric or from individuals, it's from the way the system is set up. I mean, so you look at the kinds of costs and debts that Americans incur just for functioning. Like if you get sick, that costs money and that creates debt. If you have a higher education system, even one that is continuing on Zoom at the moment, that costs money and that causes debt. Both of these things, coupled with just like the usual systems of credit, means that most Americans are in eye-watering amounts of debt. And then debt has interest, which means that you're incentivized to get back to work as fast as possible. And you put people in a position where it's not only rational, but critical to get back to earning money because it costs money to earn less. You know, I mean, it's kind of the way the system functions is such that not only do you create all these pressures, you then, coupled with this narrative of individualism, tell people that both the source of the problem and the nearest solution is to be conceived of in these individualistic autonomous senses. And that's something that we reinforce when we kind of circulate these images of Americans protesting in the way they are right now. But I think it's a real shame when we do that, because we obscure the fact that even these apparently maniacally individual faces are in fact the product of the same system that crushes the rest of us.
What's interesting about that is the way in which the conversation that's taking place in a number of different nations around the world, including Australia, around that there is an economic reality around when we need to reopen, and the fact that there are trade-offs to be made between the costs of a lockdown in terms of real human suffering and the costs in terms of human suffering of allowing COVID-19 to spread at a higher rate than it would with greater lockdowns imposed. That conversation has been framed a lot around facing up to reality, that we have to be realistic about this. But what you're suggesting there, Eleanor, is that actually this is not necessarily something that is built into reality, that this is something that's hardwired into the way that the world works, that this is something that has been created. And if we treat it as a fixed point, then we're missing out on seeing what might be one of the deeper issues at play here.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way of putting the point. There's one read on this situation, according to which it is just a matter of getting to grips with reality, that if we don't go back to work, the economy will collapse. If we don't allow people to return to earning money, they won't have any money. And there's one kind of level of Zoom where that's true. But that's true because of what you're holding fixed around it. And if you zoom out one level further to the layer where you're asking the question, well, why is it the case that unless you return to work, you won't be able to eat? Why is it the case that the economy will collapse unless we have people in the kinds of jobs that have them in labor all the time? There's a one layer extra of zooming out that I think we can do, where you no longer hold fixed the things that we are currently holding fixed about how it is that people ought to be able to get food and get money and stay safe and stay healthy. And as long as we're kind of treating as fixed the system that we currently operate in, then of course it will feel like natural realism that at a certain point we have to get back to work in order to provide those goods. But the fact that work is what provides those goods is itself kind of worth, I think, reconsidering. And one of the things that this pandemic, I think, has at least made clear is that, is that there are moments of genuine choice to be had here, and there are moments of genuine clash between the value systems that we've previously maybe thought were cohabitable. And you see people getting on TV now, and like Glenn Beck said the other day, that people like him were more than prepared to die for the economy. And at very least, what this is forcing us to do is to realize that that may not only be a choice right now, but that for a lot of people all along, that kind of was the choice.
I mean, there's two really interesting things there. The first thing that I think is, Bryan, that Glenn Beck is exactly the kind of person who is least likely to actually die for the economy. And the second thing, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, but the second thing is in the way that Eleanor has set this up as when you zoom in a particular way, you see a series of fixed choices and binary choices that are made that in fact are being fiercely held in place by a huge flurry of activity if you just take a next level zoomed out. And I think that's why I get really frustrated at the use of the trolley dilemma as an analogy for thinking about this. Because when we teach the trolley dilemma in undergraduate lectures, the first thing that the students want to do is say, well, how did these circumstances come to pass? Why aren't there better safety arrangements on the rails? They point to a number of very valid critiques, and our instinct is to say, no, you must just face the choice that is in front of you and test the principles there. But that's exactly what we shouldn't be doing here. We should be asking, how did this situation come to pass? What things are forcing us into a binary choice or making us think we have a binary choice than we don't? So can I get your read on the applicability of trolley dilemmas in this context, and what we're assuming in order to think about things in that way?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, right? So like listening to Eleanor, I was like shaking my head, like nodding vigorously. I mean, the question of framing is so important here. The frames that we take to be given, that we accept, set the parameters around which, set the parameters for credible and acceptable discourse around the subject, right? So once you buy into the idea that the choice is simply that this individual either goes to work and pays their bills, or the economy crashes, there's a narrowing that that kind of framing produces, and it just stunts our not just our imagination, but like our imaginative capacity to think through the situation. And and it keeps us from in medicine, there's this recognition that in order to understand what's going on with a person, like you initially establish what the presenting complaint is, but then you need to dig into the history of the presenting complaint. How did this thing come into being? Because a lack of understanding about how the situation came into being means that you'll never arrive at what the cause, what the root cause of the problem is. And if you don't know what the root cause of the problem is, then at best, whatever treatment solution you put forward is a gamble. And this is an integral part of medical training. And I find it really fascinating that people who are trained in some ways to think about things in a temporal way also are acculturated in thinking about, say, for example, who gets the ventilator in this trolley problem kind of atemporal, what's happening in this instant frame of thinking. And there's this really strange disjuncture, but I think that disjuncture has to do with affect, with our affective investments. Because, it is so much easier to deal with, in this instance, who should I give this ventilator to, than it is to have to grapple with how did we get to this problem, because the degrees of complexity, I struggle between, on the one hand, people who've been marginalized by an economic system, who feel that they have to risk their health to go to work. I struggle to think about what responsibility, the distribution of responsibility. Who's responsible for that? Is it the state that's responsible? Is it the legislature that's responsible? Or are those people responsible by virtue of having affirmed a certain kind of idea of what society ought to look like over a long period of time? But if you decide to just think about the instant, you don't have to worry about all of that, right? You don't have to grapple with the reality of the fact that our current situation is a world of our making through a series of choices that we've all collectively made, that we're all implicated to certain degrees. And it's just a lot easier if you can come up with a nice, simple frame that can apportion blame or responsibility or benefit in non-complex ways.
One of the things that makes me think about, I remember I was doing a radio interview, and and someone kind of texted in this point when we were talking about some of the trade-offs that are to be made, that said that, was frustrated that it's always young people who have to make these sacrifices. Young people are having to suffer through a lockdown to protect the elderly. Young people have had to go to war to fight the elderlies, for the elderlies to preserve the status quo and things like that. And whilst I have some sympathy for that kind of class politics of a different kind, what it made me think about was just how that flattens out the reality that actually the same young people who had to go off and go to war are now the elderly people who are being talked about as potentially being denied ventilators. And when we think about these things, as you say, in this kind of atemporal, like this timeless kind of way, that this is just a moment that's in a vacuum, divorced from the history of these people, it makes it so much easier to make a choice, but it also takes away so much of might be important about that choice. And that got me thinking about one of the big discussions that we're having around QALY, quality adjusted life years, where we think about what is the quality of someone's life going forward and how much quality of life are they going to get, and use that to make an assessment on who should get resources. But it's future facing. It's about how much time that person has left. It doesn't ask what kind of quality of life has this person enjoyed to this point? What kinds of benefits, privileges, injustices might they have experienced that really should inform our response to what they need in this particular moment. Is that the way that you're thinking about this, Bryan?
Yeah, absolutely. And, and I'm troubled by the baked in values, there's a baked in value, there's an unthought assumption that economic productivity, longevity, there are assumptions about what constitutes a life worth living. There's an inherent ableism in that. And there's just a whole lot of, there's a series of brutalities that go unchallenged in that way, right? Like the ability to come up with some numerical figure that somehow is supposed to correlate with the value of a life or the value of someone continuing to live is such a horrendously brutal thing. It's so incredibly brutal. But when that gets cast in the language of economics or of business, and when that gets kind of painted in terms of pragmatics and the necessity for, society as a whole to carry on, it keeps us from having to confront just the violence and the brutality of our society, and the violence and the brutality that we're willing to put up with, and again, to the issue of responsibility. I wonder sometimes if there's a tacit acceptance of things like QALYs, even by people who don't know about QALYs per se, but I wonder if there isn't this tacit acceptance in our society of the kind of really harsh, brutal econometrics, because we want to outsource our brutality towards each other in some ways and to sterilize it.
Eleanor, I keep thinking in these conversations of the person who's listening and saying, yes, this is all a very interesting and important conversation to have, but the brutal reality is this. We have to make a choice here around at what point we think about the lives that will be saved by continuing a lockdown versus the range of different real sufferings. Let's set aside the economic ones for a second. The real sufferings in terms of increased rates of domestic violence that might occur as a result of lockdowns, joblessness, mental health issues, and potential loss of life through those kinds of issues. And we do need to make a balance, strike a balancing act here. We do, as gross and unpleasant as it might be to think about, we do have to put a price or put a balancing on human lives, even if we're just pricing them against one another. And this debate, about what it reveals in terms of deeper underpins, which is exactly the way I've set this up, maybe is actually distracting from the reality. Rousseau talked about philosophers and said, barbarous philosopher, read me your book on a battlefield. Show me how this actually manifests in the real choices that we have to make. What would you say to someone who just said, let's Let's get to the pragmatics though here. We do have to make some balancing acts.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think about that listener or reader a lot, partially because I am that listener or reader. You know, I'm not blind to the fact that this is causing an untold amount of suffering, and that what we're asking people to do by staying home in each other's names is a non-trivial ask. And I think one of the ways that moral theorizing in the last little while has really failed us is by failing to engage with the scenarios like precisely this one, where there is no option that is not immense tragedy. And QALYs and a lot of the systems that we have for making these kinds of decisions, I think can sometimes, maybe accidentally, create in us the system, or rather the expectation, that we will be able to make these decisions in a way that leaves no moral remainder, in a way where we will have done the best thing that we could in the circumstances, and because it was the best thing that we could have done in the circumstances, it must have been a good thing. But I don't think that's true. I think there's plenty of cases where the best thing we can do in a situation is a wrenching, appalling moral violation, not least of ourselves, not least of having to make that decision. I think that's a really big and systematic problem with the way that we've done ethics for the last little while. I think this is one of these cases. The choices that we face are all bad choices. I want to be a little bit slow, though, to accept the choice between, this kind of loss or that kind of loss, or reopening or human lives, partly because, as a variety of epidemiologists pointed out, at the moment, it's a choice between a loss of a lot of life and a loss of economic value, or a loss of a lot of life and a loss of economic value and a loss of a vast amount of life. So what will happen if we reopen is not only will we putatively get the economy regoing, although we may not, but we'll do so in a way which also kills a lot of people, because that's how a virus works. So it's not fully clear that that we'll be able to avoid either of these harms entirely. That said, what can we do in these situations? How can we think about the choices that we have to make? The biggest thing I think for me, and I hope this is in any way useful, is to reflect on the fact that the way that we've been forced into a position where we have no options but tragedy is itself worth examining. If we find ourselves in a situation where the sets of values that we feel are non-negotiable themselves turn out to be incompatible, well, then we need to ask really serious questions about those systems of values. And we're being put in a position where all our options are ghoulish, and that should tell us something about what the list of options was to start with.
When you talk about reflecting on the kind of the tragedy and the stuckness of a situation where you're forced between bad options, I immediately think of me desperately bouncing from chemist to chemist, trying to find children's paracetamol while my 1-year-old daughter was teething, and finding them sold out everywhere. And thinking about that kind of the panic buying response. And at a certain point thinking, well, what would I do if I suddenly came across a treasure trove of children's paracetamol? Being forced into this game where we are now competing for resources because enough people are doing it, do I play that game, or do I kind of, in a moralized way, stand back and say, no, this is the wrong thing to do, I will take only my share, knowing that that might leave me deprived further down the line? So when we think about the kind of panic buying response that we saw from ordinary people at the beginning of this, what did that tell us about ourselves? For me, that was a moment to really reckon and say, what does it tell us that in the first sniff of a crisis, the first thing that we did was take care of us and ours? That was, and I say we, although not everyone participated in that kind of behavior, but what does that say to us about the way in which we've set up the society? We've talked a little bit about kind of the individualism already, but I just want to think about, in that moment of crisis, that first response, and what you were thinking about, Eleanor, when you started to see that kind of come to pass.
Yeah, I saw it in the States too. So that's the land that brought us Black Friday sales did not hold back when it came to panic buying. What did it reveal about us? Less, I think, than it revealed about our circumstance. Here's what I think it revealed about us. We were afraid and we didn't feel secure. And we didn't trust either us or the government around us to provide for us in the moment of crisis where we would most need both those things. I think it proved that more than anything particularly deep about like our innate nature, which I know people argue about a lot, does this reveal that we're fundamentally selfish? Well, yes, but then people also drove stuff to food banks and it revealed other things about benevolence and kindness and solidarity and all the nice things as well. I think more than that, it revealed that something that we kind of already know, which is that the right configuration of circumstances can push ordinary people to behave in profoundly selfish and possibly evil ways. And we know that. We know that a lot of exercises of bad behavior are perfectly ordinary, and what happens when people are frightened and insecure. And more than what I think it told us about us, I think it told us something really disquieting about the faith that we had in our systems, which was that unless we did this, unless we went out and kind of did this end of days treading on each other's necks for a can of beans, that, I mean, I don't know why everyone bought beans. I've been saying this for weeks. I don't even like beans. I don't know why I bought so many beans. Everyone just transformed into people who really like beans all of a sudden. But it told us that, like, we were willing to do that. In fact, we thought it was necessary that we do that because we were so unsure of the fact that other people and or the government and or the system would be able to provide for us if we didn't do this kind of absurd other sacrificing thing. I think we were entirely wrong.
Bryan, what's your read on this? Yeah, again, thinking about your background in delivering medicine and practicing medicine in sub-Saharan Africa and in a very different circumstance to the ones in which we are going, woe be it that this pasta is not available in my supermarket. What was your read on some of the responses on a kind of consumer and market-based level?
So, I mean, like, here I disagree with Eleanor, right? Irene Watson, a legal scholar, in her book Raw Law, she used a Noongar word, I think it's Moldavi, for colonialism. And there's an image she paints of colonialism as this voracious monster, this voracious animal that just devours and consumes. And I just find that so incredibly apt. I think it's telling that for some groups in Australia, the relationship between quote unquote mainstream society and some communities is one that's best cast as this voracious consuming, animal, this devouring thing. As a sub-Saharan African, the quality of life I enjoy today as an Australian citizen is inextricably linked to the poverty and deprivation and the suffering that a lot of continental sub-Saharan Africans and a whole bunch of people around the world experience. Those two things aren't linked. Those two things are intimately intertwined, right? There's a lot of posturing in terms of our response to the climate crisis around, well, China needs to do something first. But the fact is the bulk of Chinese industrial manufacturing work goes into products that we in the Western world consume. There's a sense in which we are voracious, we devour, and the rush to buy toilet paper, as though when the zombie apocalypse comes, the most needful thing is toilet paper. I mean, this isn't a gastroenteric virus, right? It's not like everybody's going to be on the toilet. But little things, baking powder, toilet paper, tins of tomatoes and tomato paste. People were hoarding and panic buying non-essential goods. And I don't think it was because the idea was this non-essential good is going to run out and I'm not going to be able to make brownies or cupcakes or whatever, and my life is going to come to an end. I think we have a voracious appetite. I think we have a voracious consuming, devouring appetite. I think we have a particular relationship to the environment and to others. And I think this pandemic has just shone a light on who we are, as opposed to who we like to pretend we are and and the image of ourselves we like to project.
on that question of what we think we are versus what we actually are, I'm going to ask both of you, Bryan, you first, about how we make decisions in reality versus how we think we make decisions. So Bryan, you've thought a lot about the way in which we quote unquote think in the context of a pandemic, and are using the philosopher Hannah Arendt and her idea of what actually constitutes thinking as a way of suggesting that maybe we're not doing as much thinking as we think. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, so Arendt makes this really useful distinction between the algorithmic processes, what she calls the cliches, the devices that stand in for thought that we normally go by, the assumptions, the conventional wisdom that we normally operate on. And she separates that from those moments in which we undertake that really difficult labor that forces us to stop, that's sometimes paralyzing, of grappling with a question in a sustained and deep way. And Arendt says, thought is difficult, thought is painful, thought isn't something that we like to do, hence the cliches, right? Hence the recourse to conventional wisdom. I think what she leaves out is our affective investments, because I think those drive us, our drives and our desires. Those drive us to a great extent. But, and I just think about the work of Catherine Sophia Bell, who wrote a book called Arendt and the Negro Question. And a lot of that work is showing the ways in which, when it came to the things that Arendt herself was effectively invested, she failed to think in the way that she proposed we ought to think, which in an interesting kind of way reinforces this idea that thinking is really difficult. And I'm a big fan of Eleanor's book. Despite all of our recourse to reason and rationality and reasonableness, in the best of circumstances, we are driven more often than not by reason, not by thought. And that's in the best of circumstances, And I know it's asking a lot to expect people to undertake that kind of difficult thinking at a moment of crisis. But the cost of us not doing that, it is so unlikely that there's an air with restrictions starting to be lifted now that maybe we're on the other side of this pandemic. I don't think so. But even if we are, there's another one coming, and another one, and some other disaster, given our social organization, given our relationship to the planet, given our relationship to others. And if we don't take this moment to think, what's going to happen the next time round?
Eleanor, Bryan's very generously plugged your book, Stop Being Reasonable, in which you outline some really big decisions that people make. And what you found is in each and every one of them, this idea that we are these very rational people who weigh costs and benefits, who think about principles and think in these kind of abstractions, actually doesn't play out. The ways in which people make choices aren't necessarily obvious even to themselves, let alone to the rest of us. So how does that make you think about the decisions that we're facing and the decisions that we, and I say we as individuals, but also we as societies and our political leadership, are making decisions now?
Yeah, I think one of the things that was that's kind of puzzling for me right now is that a lot of the work in that book and a lot of the writing that went into it was about coming to have quite a lot of sympathy for and understanding of the ways that people make decisions in kind of what we traditionally regard as irrational ways. I ultimately make the case that they're not irrational after all, but broadly speaking, the aim was to say, let's be softer and kinder about the fact that the way people make these decisions often involves a vast amount of their own affect, their feelings, their sense of self, who they trust, all these other kind of like very humane elements. And the book and my relationship to it was very optimistic, I think, and kind of like warm and fuzzy broadly. And one of the problems that I'm having right now is that the face of irrationality is a lot less forgivable right now. And the ways in which we allow these things to, for want of a better word, contaminate our decision-making processes are no longer, are no longer dismissible on the grounds that they have effects on people, that the only people they affect is us. The ways that these kinds of failures to think in this Arendtian conception are doing untold damage to people's lives. And I think it's something I'm really struggling with right now, is how to strike a balance between expecting, even demanding, considerably better of people in the way that we conceive of other people, the systems we're in, and the ways that we ought to govern and be governed, and simultaneously be forgiving of and understanding of the fact that this is happening in a distinctly non-ideal environment, and that what people are up to psychologically and epistemically in the middle of a crisis, and a literally life-threatening crisis, it's a difficult question. I mean, you know, if I could, it's an echoing of a point that we've made a lot, but I think that's because it's probably a good one. I hope it's a good one, which is to agree with what Bryan just said about the way that this kind of panic buying indicates something about us. I think that's right. I mean, the only thesis I mean to deny there is that it reveals something about who we are as a fundamental of nature, rather than that it reveals something about who we are in a very deep way, but who we are inside this system with this culture and this history. And I think similarly, the ways that we are failing to think well right now represent some significant failures, both in the way that we think of threats and the way we think of value, and perhaps most importantly, the way we think of each other. And I think sometimes we can be really quick to psychologize these things and to regard them as something natural and something that is the function of like our poor little lizard brains that, you know, just crawled off the savannah yesterday and are wired in these ways that can be neuroscientifically understood. And I think just like the panic buying reflects something about a very long, like, tendril leaving history about the way that we relate to goods, the earth, and commerce. Similarly, the ways that we're being irrational right now represent the current face of the ways that we've been misunderstanding and misusing all three of those things for a very long time, just as much.
Bryan's got one last point.
I completely agree. I'm struck by the ethics though, like the question of responsibility. Eleanor has this wonderful book where she talks about the ways in which our stance is our disposition is one that we've allowed ourselves to become habituated to over time. You know, so I mean, like, I completely agree that the issue isn't, say, for example, original sin or human nature or anything like that. I think the issue is the choices that we repeatedly make over time, the kind of ways of relating to others and to the world that we've habituated ourselves to. And I guess the question then, and I'm stuck on this question of responsibility, right? At what point are we all forced to take responsibility for what we've assented to? At what point are we forced to take responsibility for the political system, the economic system that we have participated in and given our assent to and have habituated ourselves to? And yeah, I don't have an answer for that, but I'm troubled by my responsibility for the situation.
And that brings us to the end of the time that we have. You might have tuned into this conversation hoping to get some quick, ethically prescribed answers to some difficult decisions that you're making. But really what hopefully you've walked away with is asking, why is it that you feel that you need that immediate and quick ready-made answer? And what have we constructed in our thinking and the world around us that's made us think in that way? We often talk about this pandemic as though it were an economic or a medical crisis, but it is just as much a moral crisis. And so we need to get to the bottom of what these ideas and assumptions about morality are if we're going to get through it, not just with human beings alive and thriving, but with our humanity intact. Eleanor and Bryan, thank you so much for joining me, and thank you for tuning in and listening to this conversation. There are a number more throughout today and tomorrow that I hope you join into. I'm Matt Beard, a fellow at the Ethics Centre, and thank you so much for joining this conversation.
This session was recorded as part of FODI Digital, presented by the Ethics Centre. The Ethics Centre delivers programs and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of our life. We offer free counselling for individuals, consulting, leadership and development services. As a non-profit charity, we rely heavily on donations to continue our work, which can be made via our website. Thank you.